The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. And we say hello to David Daley, author of Rat Effed, Why Your Vote Doesn't Count, and Unrigged, How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy. He is a senior fellow at Fair Vote. David Daley, thanks for joining us today, and welcome back to the America's Democrats podcast.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me back.
Always a pleasure to have you with us. Now, as we get closer to the 2022 election, you've been drawing our attention to the role gerrymandering could have. Remind us how gerrymandering happens and what is the timeline we're looking at right now?
Yeah, it's a great question. We are really right in the very heart of this moment. Redistricting happens every 10 years. It follows the census. The census was completed last year. Census data is coming to states by mid-August. And then this process of drawing the maps that will define our politics for the next decade at the state legislative and the congressional level will really get underway in earnest. We have seen over the course of the last 10 years just how toxic an impact partisan gerrymandering can have on our politics, on our policy, and on our ability to respond even to a pandemic. And so this is a moment in which we need to be really aware of what is happening in state legislatures around the country and really pushing our lawmakers to act on partisan gerrymandering and do what they can to put an end to it before the next decade of our politics gets frozen into place and it's too late.
Yeah, well, it's certainly long overdue. Now, you recently wrote at The Guardian that Republicans can win the next election through gerrymandering alone, even if voters vote the same way as in 2020. How could this happen and where?
Yeah, it is really, I think, a sign of just how long-lasting these maps have been and the challenges that Democrats face around the country. Look, Democratic candidates for the U.S. House in 2020 won 4.7 million more votes than Republican candidates nationwide. That is the largest margin in a long time. But Democrats only have a 5-seat advantage. So you win by 4.7 million votes, and that only leads you to about 222, 223 seats. When Republicans back in 2014 had their best year at the House level in some time, they won by a margin of about 4.4 million votes, and that got them 247 seats. So that's a pretty big difference, and you can see the impact of gerrymandering and also political geography in that difference. So Republicans are going to have the complete power in 2020 to redraw lines in Texas, North Carolina, Florida, and Georgia for potentially as many as 2 or as many as 3 seats in some of those states. And then they're also going to have the ability to redraw lines in New Hampshire, Kansas, Missouri, Tennessee, and Kentucky. And in some of those states, Republican lawmakers have already made clear that they intend to either gerrymander the last remaining Democrat out, as they have said in Kansas or in New Hampshire, where they've made it really clear that they intend to claim at least one of the 2 U.S. House seats in that state. And then you've got folks like Congressman Cooper in Tennessee, or Congressman Yarmouth in Louisville, Kentucky, where you have blue city Democrats in deep red states. And it would be really easy for Republicans who have complete control of the process there to simply crack those cities in half, draw a line through them, attach half of those Democrats to one rural Republican district and the other half to another, make it almost impossible for a Democrat to actually win those seats. So I would say you're looking at somewhere between 12 and 14 seats that Republicans could claim through redistricting alone, so that you could have the same outcome, the exact same vote distribution. But because the lines move in some of those all important states, it affects outcomes.
Absolutely. Now, you've also been writing about the undemocratic influence of gerrymandering for quite some time now. How is it that we're still having this discussion?
Boy, oh boy, are you telling me that I'm boring? Because, yeah, no, I understand. We've been having this conversation for a long time. Listen, when minority rule gets entrenched within our politics, it's really hard to do anything about it, right? Because the legislative process has to be engaged to do anything about it. And Republicans who have gerrymandered themselves into power in North Carolina and Texas and Georgia and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, they aren't looking to do anything about it. They're looking to, pass laws right now that make it, that restrict voting rights even further in those states. Now, Democrats do have complete control of Congress and the White House. They have a trifecta in Washington, D.C. And we have this moment right now, a moment that might not happen again for, a long time, given the structural advantages that Republicans have in the Electoral College with the small state bias of the U.S. Senate, and that gerrymandering will give them in the U.S. House over the course of the next decade. So Democrats have got to be right now thinking about how they pass the For the People Act, how they put an end to partisan gerrymandering, how they protect voting rights and restore the protections of the Voting Rights Act that this US Supreme Court has just been so brutally eviscerating over the course of the last decade, whether in the Shelby County case that attacked Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, whether in the gerrymandering cases like Abbott v. Texas and Common Cause versus Rucho that effectively closed the doors of the federal courthouses to partisan gerrymandering claims, and also made it much more difficult to show racial intent on a racial gerrymander. And then the case that we had back in June, Brnovich versus DNC, which effectively gutted key provisions of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. If Democrats in Washington cannot find it within themselves to make a carve out to the filibuster for voting rights in the middle of what really ought to be seen as a 5-alarm fire for representative democracy, we are in for a really difficult decade.
How about the Electoral College? How is this going to affect the Electoral College?
I think what we could see here, and the system held ever so narrowly in 2020, right? And I think what we forget sometimes, because Joe Biden won what was one of the larger popular vote mandates of the last 35 or 40 years. He won the national popular vote by about 7.5 million. And yet he only won the Electoral College by taking about 44,000 votes in 3 states, Georgia, Arizona, and Wisconsin. If those 44,000 votes in those close states go another way, you're looking at a 269 Electoral College tie. And as we know, if the Electoral College is tied, you go to a state delegation by state delegation vote, and Republicans have more delegations. So you would have likely seen Donald Trump reelected with an even larger popular vote deficit than he had in 2016 against Hillary Clinton. We have already seen what gerrymandered legislatures in Georgia and Wisconsin and what an extreme Republican legislature in Arizona are working on right now when it comes to voting rights. They are trying to suppress and build barriers before just enough voters in those 3 close states in order to make it extraordinarily difficult for Democrats to win another close race there in 2024. In Georgia, they are changing the rules on who controls and who certifies elections. They are trying to put, for example, the Fulton County Election Board, which contains the city of Atlanta, under control of the state legislature. And if what we see in 2024 are more fraudits like we've seen in Arizona, are more attempts to make it more difficult for Democrats to win statewide electors and to have those electors certified by Republican legislatures. I mean, if say Democrats win in Pennsylvania and Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin and Georgia and Arizona, will gerrymandered state legislatures in those states certify the results and send the proper electors to Washington? And these are the questions that I think ought to be keeping a lot of us up at night, and that really threaten the foundations of our system.
And in terms of turning this around, what's your response to how Democrats have responded to gerrymandering?
I think that Democrats really fell asleep on this back in 2010. After the big victories of 2008, I think Democrats in many ways thought that they had an inevitable coalition of rising and changing demographics, and that they'd be in charge for a long time. And Republicans ran a really effective play in 2010 to kind of take back state legislatures and redraw maps in 2011. And we've seen that it's been really difficult for Democrats to win on those maps ever since. And so while I do think that there is a lot of blame to be had for the failures back in 2010, what we're seeing is that it's really difficult to defeat a gerrymander. It's really difficult to out-organize a gerrymander. And so when I hear Democrats now saying that, well, we're just going to put more money into get out the vote efforts, or we're just going to attempt to register more voters, that is not a play that has worked in North Carolina or Wisconsin or Texas or Pennsylvania or Michigan against these gerrymandered maps all decade. You cannot out-organize and out-register voter suppression and extreme partisan gerrymandering. A lot of Democrats understand this, and I think that you are seeing movement on the For the People Act, but there's a couple of Democratic senators who are blocking this and are standing in the way of the kind of filibuster reform that is going to be necessary to really protect and defend democracy.
Well, and I know you are a strong advocate of the For the People Act. Do you see a path for it to pass?
I think the only path for it to pass will be if Senators Manchin and Sinema are willing to change their minds on the filibuster. And I think all they have to do is look at what's happening in state capitals around the country and understand that we are under assault right now, and that this is an assault that is determined to create an entrenched and enduring Republican minority rule that will be really difficult to defeat at the ballot box, we have a moment right now in which we can try to do something about it, and we absolutely have to. I mean, Senators Manchin and Sinema keep talking about how any changes to election laws and reforms have to be bipartisan. What do they think is happening at state legislatures around the country? Are these changes in Georgia and Arizona and Wisconsin and North Carolina and Florida and Texas, are they bipartisan? They are not bipartisan. This is a deeply partisan assault on the nature of representative democracy. And it is going to take Democrats to stand up and choose democracy over the filibuster, or else, I fear we will all have these sleepless nights in the future.
Well, short of passing the For the People Act, what can Democrats do, or what can voters do?
We have got to be really loud in this moment. Reverend Jesse Jackson and Reverend Barber in North Carolina have been leading these rallies and getting arrested. When you look at Jesse Jackson this summer, 79 years old with Parkinson's disease, in the August heat, 50 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, still putting his body on the line for voting rights and to defend democracy. I think that there's two ways of looking at this, right? I mean, one is we ought to be filled with sadness and rage that 50 years after Selma, we are still having this exact debate in this country. But I think that there's a lot of inspiration that we can take in this moment from people who have been having this fight all of their lives, who understand that the push and pull, the arc of moral justice in this country has never just gone in one direction, that the arc of moral justice only bends when we all get our hands on it and pull it in the right direction, and that we all have that responsibility to it doesn't mean we all have to get arrested, but it means we ought to be taking part in these rallies. We ought to be calling our members of Congress. We ought to be making it clear in state legislatures around the country, if you live in North Carolina or Wisconsin or Georgia or Arizona, that you are watching as these maps are being drawn, that it will not be okay that politicians who try to take these maps and lines into back rooms and bunkers and private map rooms and law firms like they want to do, they will not get away with it. They will be shamed, and we are watching and we are fighting back.
All right. David Daley, author of Rat Effed, Why Your Vote Doesn't Count, and Unrigged, How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy. David, as always, we appreciate your time with us today. Would love to do it again soon.
A pleasure. Thank you.
And this is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Our local newspapers are being merged, purged, shrunk, shut down, and looted by Wall Street profiteers. Yet, there's good news. In the towns those media vultures are torching, a phoenix is rising. Hundreds of determined locals, often led by people of color, are finding new ways to pay for and revive top-quality local journalism. For example, the Ferndale Enterprise moved to an old Victorian home, renting upstairs rooms to vacationers to subsidize the paper. Also, while aloof Wall Street owners have no connection to us or our towns, the scrappy new community papers are stressing their grassroots connection by moving into friendlier, more central, street-level spaces such as public libraries and community centers so that regular people can see them and have direct access to their reporters and editors. Then there's the editor of the Sahan Journal in Minneapolis, who moves his weekly editorial meeting to the offices of various grassroots groups so their members can help shape the paper's coverage. And in Marfa, Texas, the Big Bend Sentinel is literally serving the public not only with a good weekly, but also with the Sentinel, a combo coffee shop, cozy bar, cafe, event space, and hangout for locals to meet and greet. In ways big and small, dedicated local journalists are experimenting with funding, structure, staffing, etc. to produce the news that democracy requires. Note to Wall Street vultures, these newspaper ventures aren't interested in scaling up to maximize investor profits. As they know, it was corporate cost-cutting, consolidation, and scaling that got us into today's mess of journalistic collapse. And, unlike the Wall Street model, their success is not measured simply by financial return, but also by how they do at keeping citizens informed and engaged. This is Jim Hightower saying, now that's real journalism. The Hightower Radio Lowdown is brought to you by the Lowdown Happy Hour, now live streaming on Facebook from the Chat and Chew Cafe. So grab a libation, pull up a virtual chair, and join our freewheeling conversations with political mavericks, musical agitators, and kick-ass grassroots groups. The Lowdown Happy Hour will connect you to good trouble activists who are building people power across America. Get the lowdown at hightowerlowdown.org.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee.
Was this, in your judgment, an attempted coup d'etat? Is it right to use the word coup for what happened?
But that was the very central part of the action. Yes, there was an attempt at a coup. It's a weird word to use in American political parlance because we don't have a lot of experience of experiencing coups directly in the country. And we think of a coup as something that takes place by a president. Or rather against a president, but this was a coup that took place by the president against the vice president and against the Congress. But yes, that was the red hot center of the action. But there were other things going on at the same time because there was also a violent insurrection organized by and coordinated with domestic violent extremist groups like the Proud Boys, who of course were told to stand back and stand by President Trump, like the Three Percenters, like the Oath Keepers, who have been charged with seditious insurrection and seditious conspiracy. And also there was a mass demonstration called for a wild purpose by the president, which turned into mob violence and ended up injuring and wounding 150 of our officers.
You talked about that in preparation for January 6th, you and your colleagues in the House did a lot of research. They might try this, they might try that. And you say you were prepared for everything except violence, right? Never expected that.
Well, we were preparing for a series of essentially parliamentary moves, right, or quasi-parliamentary moves against Joe Biden's majority of 306 in the Electoral College. We also were aware that there would be violence outside, but what we were completely unprepared for was the violence entering the Capitol, essentially merging with the coup, shutting down the counting of Electoral College votes for the first time in U.S. history.
Did you ever fear for your life or the life of your family members who were in the Capitol?
Well, I certainly feared for Tabitha and for my son-in-law, Hank, who had come with me on that day Tabitha had tried to convince me not to go in, and I told her it was a constitutional requirement. It's in the 12th Amendment that on the first Wednesday of the first week of January, we get together, the House and the Senate, to count Electoral College votes. So I saw there being no choice, but I invited them to come with me, and other family members, and Tabitha and Hank decided to come. And I did fear for their life, because they ended up being caught in Steny Hoyer's office off of the House floor. They barricaded themselves into his room with my chief of staff. They pushed the desk and other furniture up against the door, which they had locked. And then they hid under a desk, and they were hiding under a desk for more than an hour. I record in the book, Bill, how I felt strangely no fear for myself, because we had just suffered the worst possible loss. The very worst thing that I could imagine happening had just happened. We had buried my son Tommy the day before, on January 5th. So I was in a very weird state, but I was experiencing a lot of anger, a lot of concern for Tabitha and Hank and other people, but I was walking around not afraid at all.
It is, a lot of people have concluded, say that Donald Trump inspired what happened on January 6th. What role do you see that he played? Did he do more than inspire, actually organize, help plan?
Well, he definitely incited it. And of course, we had concurrent, robust bipartisan majorities in both the House and the Senate, finding that he had incited violent insurrection against the Union. And I think there was no doubt about that. And even though the vote was 57-43, falling 10 votes short of a conviction, I think he was convicted in the court of public opinion, and convicted in the eyes of both the world and history. But since then, I believe that the select committee on January 6th is arriving rapidly to conclusion that he not just incited the insurrection, but he helped to coordinate and organize the insurrection. But the details are coming out now, and we're going to put together a methodical narrative reciting exactly what we found. But he clearly was no innocent bystander, just as the insurrection and the attempted coup were not a case of his supporters presenting flowers and hugs and kisses to the police officers on that day.
Were you surprised by Mike Pence's letter on the morning of January 6th saying, I do not have the power to overturn the Electoral College. I am not going to do what the president wants me to do?
I was very pleasantly surprised to receive it. I was grateful that he was so emphatic and categorical about the fact that he had no power, just like no other vice president in U.S. history had any power, simply to reject and rebuff and repudiate Electoral College votes coming in from the states. And he was extremely careful and painstaking in his analysis, and I was excited that he did it. I was a little bit amazed that he was also so clear about precisely what Donald Trump had been asking him to do, which was to declare these extra constitutional and unprecedented powers just to reject Electoral College votes.
And as you point out, again, and detailed in the book, had he done so, that would have pushed the whole question before the House, correct? As in a contingent House election, what would that have amounted to?
Well, that's right. The whole purpose of getting Pence to try to deny Joe Biden his 306 Electoral College majority and to lower his vote total below 270 was to trigger the 12th Amendment, which says that the House of Representatives must move immediately into a vote for president. And you ask, why might Trump want the vote to be referred to the House, where Speaker Pelosi and the Democrats were in control? Well, under the 12th Amendment, we're not voting one member, one vote. We're voting one state, one vote. They had 27 states after the 2020 elections. We have 22 states on the Democratic side, and Pennsylvania is tied. So even had they lost Liz Cheney, the at-large representative from Wyoming, as I think they probably would have, they still would have had a 26-vote majority. They would have run it very quickly, like the Republican National Convention declared a victory for Donald Trump on the floor, and he likely would have followed the advice of Michael Flynn, his disgraced former national security advisor, who had been urging him to invoke the Insurrection Act and declare something like martial law in the country. And he probably would have done that and called in the National Guard to put down the insurrectionary chaos that he had helped subject us to.
So we've all been disappointed, Congressman, and I know you're a big supporter of the Voting Rights Act, which could not get through the Senate because of Republican opposition. But is it important to pass the Electoral Reform Act, not in place of the Voting Rights Act, but just to clarify who has what authority the vice president has in the electoral count?
Well, I would say on balance, it would make sense for us to pass some amendments to the Electoral Count Act. I hesitate only because of two things. One is that we don't want in any way to play into Donald Trump's hands, because he, of course, has been saying that Mike Pence had the power to overturn the election, and nobody believes he had the power to overturn the election. Mike Pence didn't believe it. His lawyers didn't believe it. We in Congress didn't believe it. Commanding majorities of the House and the Senate rejected that, and nobody in history has ever said it. So we don't want in any way to concede any ground to this notion that there was a legitimate argument taking place, because there wasn't. But the other part of it is that because of that truth, we're not in any danger in 2024 that Kamala Harris will get up and assert lawless ultra-virus powers to reject electoral college votes. And so that it's not only is it not an important issue for the next election, it really might not be an issue at all. Having said that, we could do some things that at least elucidate what has always been understood about it. But look, we can't fight the last battle. And that's my basic point. The elections for 2024 and 2022 are coming under furious attack by Donald Trump and his supporters. In the states, they want to replace the deeply ingrained tradition of bipartisan election administration with partisan election administration. They want appeals not to go to courts or to go to bipartisan bodies, but to go to GOP-controlled state legislatures. So they're trying to roll back the rights of the people to vote in early voting and weekend voting with mail-in balloting. They want to make it extremely complex. They want to make it necessary to jump through a lot of hoops. And then they want to refer people to GOP-controlled bodies. And that's what we have to be focused on. The Electoral Count Act, while significant, is kind of yesterday's news at this point.
If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.